Some truths echo long after the voices that spoke them are silenced. In the hush of stained-glass halls and behind the velvet hush of confessionals, a death waited, draped in ritual, deception, and the quiet weight of belief. When justice wears a collar and guilt hides behind sermons, only a mind unmoved by faith, but not untouched by truth, can unravel the rest. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. There are only two forces on earth that can get me into a pew before noon on a Sunday. One is Nero Wolfe under court order. The other is Lily Rowan under no order at all. She had called me Saturday afternoon with that lilting voice she uses when she's half amused and half plotting. "Archie, darling, I have a favour. Clare Talbot needs someone discreet and observant to attend a church service tomorrow. That's you, in case I wasn't clear." Clare Talbot, I recalled, was the one with high cheekbones, meticulous diction, and a job that involved organising the socks and secrets of Bishop Alaric Hutchins. She was also Lily's former Vassar roommate, which meant declining the invitation was going to cost me more than the price of brunch. "Is this church business or romantic espionage?" I asked. "She's worried about something," Lily said. "Won't say what, but she asked for you." And that was how I found myself, sharp-shaved and glum-eyed, climbing the stone steps of St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral on a brisk March morning, with the organ already groaning inside like it knew this wasn't going to be just another Sunday. St. Mark's Cathedral was the kind of place that made you feel either smaller or guiltier, depending on what you brought in with you. It had stone columns like carved sentinels, stained glass windows the size of movie screens, and a choir loft tucked high enough to make angels sound contractual. I slid into a seat near the back, second pew from the rear, centre aisle. A perfect spot for observation and a quick exit, should fire, brimstone, or a surplus of tithing envelopes erupt. Clare Talbot, sitting 2 rows ahead and to the left, gave me a slight nod without turning fully around. She looked tense, not fashionably tense, but wire-drawn and listening for something not being said. The crowd was upper middle moral, men in charcoal suits, women in Sunday florals and hats you couldn't wear on the subway without a lawsuit. A few faces were notable, a silver-haired gentleman with ecclesiastical rings on both hands, a younger reverend with eyes too earnest to be safe, and a woman sitting alone in a burgundy cloche who studied the altar like it owed her an apology. It wasn't my usual crowd, but I'd seen rooms like this before, right before the curtain lifted. The organ dropped into a final chord, the choir's last syllable floated away, and then Bishop Alaric Hutchins stepped forward to the pulpit. Tall, thin, and usually described as serene, he didn't look serene now. His cassock hung loose at the collar, his hair was a little wild at the temples, and his hands gripped the wood like he wasn't sure it would hold him. "Blessed are those who mourn," he began, voice steady, but with an edge that carried. "For they shall be comforted, but what comfort have we given? And what sins have we allowed to bloom under the guise of tradition?" That got attention. The silver-haired donor stirred in his seat. A few heads turned. This wasn't a pastoral homily, this was something else. "I speak not today of individual vice," he continued, eyes sweeping the congregation like a judge with a sealed verdict, "but of silence, of complicity, of silver offered to the temple that buys not salvation, but secrecy." Clare's spine went rigid. "There is sin among us in high places," the bishop said, "and the hour is coming when that sin will be named." He stopped then. No benediction, no amen. Just a long pause, and then he stepped back. The silence that followed was too thick for reverence. It was the kind of silence that precedes either redemption or detonation. I caught up with Clare in the narthex, where the scent of incense hadn't yet given way to the scent of gossip. She greeted me with a look that hovered between gratitude and fear, then steered me away from the cluster of parishioners offering their practiced pieties to the clergy. That wasn't the sermon he planned to give. she said quietly. It was something else. Something he wrote late last night. I nodded, as if I already knew. Sometimes it works better than asking questions. He's been afraid, she continued, her voice barely audible over the reverberating footsteps around us. There have been notes, anonymous, not threats exactly, but warnings, subtle, oily. Typewritten? Number worse, handwritten, ink and carelessness. She reached into her bag, paused, then changed her mind and withdrew her hand. I shouldn't involve you, but I'm scared he's going to do something that can't be undone. I could have said a number of things. That Wolfe didn't take cases on the strength of cryptic premonitions. That Sunday mornings were for coffee, not clergy. That sermons rarely lead to funerals. But none of them would have mattered, because I already had the same feeling the bishop did, the kind that doesn't wait for proof. I was halfway through a quiet evening, and Fritz's mushroom tart when the phone rang, and I knew before I picked it up that it wasn't going to be about the Knicks. Clare's voice was clipped and hollow. "He's dead," she said. "He died an hour ago." The bishop, it turned out, had been found in his study at the rectory. Face pale, body slumped over a blotter like a man who'd nodded off mid-thought. The attending physician, summoned with the speed of someone who keeps a cassock pressed for such events, called it a heart attack. Natural, tragic, and deeply regrettable. Except that Clare didn't buy it. And, if I'm honest, neither did I. She gave me the details in short, surgical lines. The bishop had been working on a sermon, not the one he gave that morning, but something else. The original was missing. So was the new will he had drafted yesterday. And there was something off about the timing. He had just taken his nightly brandy, hadn't seemed unwell, and then suddenly sat in silence. I jotted it all down, more out of instinct than protocol. Wolfe, in theory, wasn't involved, but death has a way of bending theory into invitation. I thanked her and hung up. Then I poured myself a brandy, sat down, and tried not to wonder whether the bishop had died for preaching a truth, or for deciding not to. Clare called again the next morning. This time her voice was taut with urgency and something quieter. Guilt, maybe, or the chill of hindsight. "They're using the old will," she said. "The one from 3 years ago. But I saw him sign a new one yesterday. I typed it myself. He made 2 copies. He said it had to be done before the next Sunday." "Why?" I asked. He didn't say. But he mentioned names. Said if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be the end of the story. And now, they're gone. The sermon. The will. Everything. There wasn't much to add. Just the dry realization that we were already behind the 8 ball, and that the man who might have explained it was currently waiting on a marble slab, his secrets cooling with him. At 10:15 sharp, Clare arrived at the brownstone with the kind of face that belongs in the foyer of a man like Wolfe, pale, controlled, and hiding a fuse. She handed me a sealed envelope, and I brought it to the man himself, who was halfway through his second glass of orange juice and working his way toward intellectual clarity. He opened it, glanced at the jagged fragment inside, a piece of paper torn diagonally, lined with script that might have come from revelation or resignation. It bore 3 initials, 2 of them matched members of the diocesan board. Wolfe sniffed, not at the evidence, but at the interruption. "I do not pry into church affairs," he said, "nor do I chase shadows cast by sermons or fears. I suggest Miss Talbot entrust this to the police or her pastor." Clare's chin lifted a notch. "He's dead." Wolfe inclined his head. "Then may he rest. I do not intend to follow him." But I knew, from the slight narrowing of his eyes, that something had already taken root. Wolfe was seated at his desk beneath the globe, eyes half closed, hands steepled like a bishop, minus the humility. Clare Talbot stood across from him, upright as a hymn, holding the sermon fragment with the reverence of relic. "Mr. Wolfe," she said gently. "I don't believe his death was natural. The bishop knew something. He said so." Wolfe sighed through his nose. "Madam, I do not doubt the late bishop possessed knowledge as any sentient adult must. What I do doubt is its relevance to me." She faltered, then held out the torn paper. He didn't reach for it. "This is a draft he never delivered. He was rewriting everything. He said the church was rotting from the inside." Wolfe's lids lifted a fraction. "And did he intend to cleanse it by liturgy or litigation?" She glanced at me, then back at Wolfe. He named people in the sermon, people on the board. Wolfe exhaled like a man refusing to be tempted by heresy. "I have no quarrel with ecclesiastical corruption," he said. "It thrives precisely because it wraps itself in dignity." Clare pressed her lips together, nodded once, and left. I gave him a look. He didn't return it, but he also didn't pick up his book, which told me the wheel had turned, whether he liked it or not. When Nero Wolfe decides not to move, he does so with the obstinacy of a cathedral. And when he decides not to investigate, he leaves a vacuum too spacious for my conscience. So the next morning, without fanfare or clearance, I made a detour past Lexington Avenue and headed for the diocesan offices at St. Mark's. The polite word was condolence, the accurate one was reconnaissance. Clare had called ahead and arranged a visitor's badge for me, which meant my presence was unofficial but permitted like incense in a courtroom. The office building stood beside the cathedral like a well-kept secret, all stone and hush. Inside, the atmosphere was somewhere between mourning and scheduling. Secretaries typed in rhythms that sounded too fast for grief. I was offered coffee and directed upstairs to meet whoever was available to assist, which, in this context, meant whoever felt the least likely to be caught with their hand in the sacramental till. As I climbed the stairs, I reminded myself that Wolfe would not approve. That, I confess, was half the reason I kept going. Dean Malcolm Reeves had the voice of a man who could bless a wedding, negotiate a grant, and recite an alibi, all without changing tone. He welcomed me with a hand both warm and reluctant, the way a politician greets a journalist without a notebook. "So tragic," he said, gesturing me into his office. Bishop Hutchins was a man of exceptional grace. His death has left a deep void. I gave him the proper sympathetic nod. I gather he had plans for reform. The dean's smile adjusted itself by a degree. He was passionate, certainly, but his health had been in decline. There were moments of confusion. Before or after he rewrote his sermon? A flicker in the eyes, barely. I can't speak to that. He often revised his messages up to the final hour. A perfectionist. And the will? I understand the family prefers not to discuss internal matters during this time of grief, which meant he knew exactly what had been done with it. When I left, I shook his hand again, this time noting the smoothness of the skin, like a man unused to labor, but fluent in power. Reverend Paul Luen was younger than I expected, 30, maybe, with clear eyes and that rare ecclesiastical quality, sincerity. When I introduced myself, he glanced around nervously and motioned me into a side corridor with a worn tapestry and less traffic. He was trying to protect something, he said, without waiting for my question. Something important. He said there were forces working against the integrity of the church, not theological, financial. I kept my expression neutral. Did he say who? Luen hesitated. Number, but he was afraid and determined. I think he knew it might cost him. There was something trembling behind his composure, not guilt, not yet, but the awareness that truth was a moving target and someone had started loading the rifles. I thanked him, and he nodded, clearly relieved to be neither confessing nor denying anything. He turned away, straightening his collar like it might shield him from whatever was coming. I wasn't convinced it would. Vera Hutchins received me in a room that smelled faintly of lavender and old upholstery. She was dressed in navy silk, her gloves folded in her lap, her expression composed to the point of artistry. "I'm sure you're doing your duty," she said coolly. "But I've already spoken with the authorities." "I'm not the authorities," I replied. "And you weren't particularly close with the bishop, from what I gather." She arched an eyebrow. "We had different rhythms." I didn't press. Sometimes what people don't say saves you the trouble of asking. "Did he mention changing his will?" A flicker, not a blink. A flicker. "He said a number of things," she said. "He was under stress. Not always sleeping." That was confirmation by evasion, a technique I'd seen often and never admired. "I won't speculate on your intentions," she added. "But grief can make people inventive. I hope you're not one of them." I left her sitting there, unbothered and immaculate, like someone auditioning for the role of innocent widow. If it was an audition, she might have over-rehearsed. Harlan Coyle looked like a man who wore his conscience behind his tie. His handshake was damp, his smile mechanical, and the office he led me into was too clean to be trusted. "We're still reeling, of course," he said, pulling his jacket closed like a defense mechanism. "The bishop was formidable." "Did you work closely with him?" "I processed his financial directives, yes, but not lately. He'd become a bit, well, insular." "And the audit?" His head jerked slightly. "Audit?" I let that hang. "I mean the restoration fund. Did he mention discrepancies?" He chuckled, badly. "Mr. Goodwin, I believe you're misinformed. There's been no audit. Nothing irregular." That was a lie with loose stitching. "And the will?" His hands fidgeted with a letter opener. "I wouldn't be privy to that sort of document." "Of course not. Only the money." When I thanked him and left, he gave a nod that was almost grateful. Which is what told me he was hiding something worth finding. Clare called me just after dusk, her voice tight enough to pluck. "They know," she said. "I found a note. Under my door, no envelope." I didn't ask how she knew it wasn't just the usual morning hysteria. "What did it say?" She hesitated. "Let the dead stay buried, or join them." That earned a pause even on my end. "Typed?" "Number ink, smudged, block letters, nothing traceable." "Did you keep it?" "Yes, of course." I told her to hold tight and keep her lights on, metaphorically and literally. Then I hung up and sat for a moment, letting the silence stretch. There are threats made in anger and threats made in calculation. The latter are always the ones worth worrying about. I slid the phone back into its cradle and began planning what Wolfe would refer to as a series of unsanctioned excursions. He could call them whatever he liked. I was already making them. If there's a man alive who can track down a shadow with a credit record, it's Saul Panzer. I had asked him, quietly and off-book, to do some looking around while I did the handshaking. He arrived at the brownstone the next morning with a look that counted as animated by Saul's standards. "The bishop's new will," he said, handing me a folder. "Gone?" I opened it. "How gone?" "It was filed and signed, witnessed, scheduled to be executed next week. As of this morning, the record's gone. The lawyer's copy is missing. Parish copy never submitted. And," Saul pointed to a separate sheet, "the old will, the one from 1949, now recognized as primary. And guess who benefits? Dean Malcolm Reeves." I took a breath and let it sit. Saul nodded once, then left. I walked into the office and handed Wolfe the folder without comment. He read silently for a full minute, then said, "It seems the Lord works in mysterious and criminal ways." He didn't speak again for some time, and I let the silence thicken like broth. When he did, it was without irony. "We will proceed," he said. I leaned a hip against the desk. "But it's ecclesiastical melodrama." He met my eyes. "It is murder. That renders melodrama moot." There was no declaration, no sudden transformation, just a quiet shift in the air, like watching a mountain begin to lean. I went to my desk, flipped open my notebook, and drew a clean line beneath the morning's notes. The case was open. And Wolfe, having declined salvation, had settled for justice. When Wolfe finally admitted the case into his rotund sphere of operation, he did so not with ceremony, but with a grunt and an order. "Summon Miss Talbot," he said. "I want every document she possesses, originals, no paraphrase." He didn't look up from his chair in the office, which was angled slightly toward the corner orchid table, as if his logic benefited from chlorophyll proximity. "You're sure you're ready to be contaminated by vestments and moral absolutes?" I asked. Wolfe snorted. "Theology is a social mechanism for organized emotion. It does not interest me. What interests me is that someone has expunged a testamentary document and removed a clergyman whose sermon threatened exposure." Clare arrived 20 minutes later with a battered folder and the same set jaw. Wolfe, in rare generosity, offered her a seat. "You will give me dates, names, and evidence, no interpretations. The soul is the province of your late employer. Ideal, in fact." She nodded, opened the folder, and began to speak. And just like that, the brownstone had acquired a congregation of the damned, the grieving, and the not yet caught. Kramer arrived later that day with a face like a burst radiator and the autopsy report in a sealed envelope. He didn't wait for permission to enter. "You had to stick your nose in, didn't you?" he growled. "You couldn't let a heart attack be a heart attack." "Indeed," Wolfe replied without rising. As it turns out, the bishop's heart failed under the weight of 1.2 milligrams of digitalis. Rather generous for a prescription. Or do you dispute your coroner's arithmetic? Kramer slapped the folder on Wolfe's desk. "It's there, cardiac glycoside poisoning, but there's no vial, no residue, no delivery system, just the body and your pet theory." Wolfe leaned back, steepled his fingers. "I have no theories, Inspector. Only an observation. The bishop gave a sermon calculated to provoke reaction. He named no names, but he wrote them." Kramer glared at me. "And I suppose you found the will, the missing papers, the convenient motive?" "Not yet," I said. "But we're getting warmer. Try the diocese treasurer. He sweats when he lies." Kramer grunted. "You're playing with politics and altar boys. If this turns into a circus, Wolfe, I'll make you the elephant." "I assure you," Wolfe murmured, "I never perform for peanuts." After Kramer left, stomping out like he'd been excommunicated without trial, Wolfe reached for the sermon draft Clare had provided. It was torn along the lower edge, stained faintly with ink, and thick with subtext. "This," Wolfe said, tapping the page with a forefinger, "was no homily, it was a declaration." He glanced up at me. What the bishop wrote was not theological, it was political, economic, and deeply targeted. I nodded. But in ecclesiastical language, fire, brimstone, and sin in high places. "Which is the idiom of the pulpit," Wolfe said, "but beneath the metaphor lies intent. He accused unnamed parties of betrayal, of corruption, cloaked in ritual." That sermon was a loaded gun. He merely refrained from pulling the trigger aloud. I watched his face. Wolfe does not feel things in the ordinary way, but when he reads a man's final words, something flickers. Not empathy, perhaps, but a scholar's melancholy for logic lost. "So," I said, "you think he was killed not for what he said, but for what he didn't?" "Precisely," Wolfe replied, "because silence, Mr. Goodwin, is sometimes more dangerous than disclosure." It didn't take long, met a few discreet calls, a favour or two cashed, before I found the whisper behind the curtain. The bishop had ordered a financial audit, not a formal one, mind you, no board minutes, no committee vote. Just a quiet request to a retired accountant named Elijah Brett, who lived in a 2-room flat in the Bronx and still wore 3-piece suits on Tuesdays. Brett wasn't chatty, but when I told him the bishop was dead, his face lost its colour. "He said there were inconsistencies," Brett muttered. "He asked me to review ledgers from the Restoration Fund. Didn't want church oversight, just eyes he could trust." "Did you find anything?" "I found gaps," he said. "Allocations with no recipients, repairs billed twice, names that don't match donors." "Did anyone else know?" He hesitated. "Reverend Luen and Miss Talbot. No one else." I left him sipping cold tea in a chair that creaked louder than he did. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe my notes. He wanted to clean house, I said. Quietly. Wolfe snorted. He should have used a vacuum. Instead, he picked up a broom and the rats noticed. If Dean Reeves had worn a mitre that day, he couldn't have looked more prepared to step into the role of shepherd. When I returned to the cathedral office under the guise of a follow-up condolence, he welcomed me like a man still mourning, but keeping an eye on the seating chart. "I trust Miss Talbot has what she needs," he said, folding his hands on the desk like a news anchor about to break a soft scandal. Of course, the bishop's passing leaves both a spiritual and administrative void. I let that sit a moment. "Any thoughts on who might fill it?" His eyebrows lifted just enough. "I've had conversations, informal ones, with trustees. The needs of the diocese must come before personal grief." I nodded. "Naturally." He offered a wan smile, not quite rehearsed. "The bishop wanted stability, continuity, and your name came up. I've served faithfully." That was one way of putting it. Later that afternoon, a donor Clare had mentioned confirmed that Reeves had quietly floated his name. The ink wasn't dry on the bishop's death certificate, but the political machinery was already humming. Wolfe, when I told him, merely muttered, "Ambition is no sin, unless it leaves fingerprints." Vera Hutchkins, when visited the second time, had traded the grief ensemble for a darker silk, which looked more like evening than morning. She received me with the same cool precision, but the edges were softening, or fraying. "You're persistent, Mr. Goodwin," she said, not entirely disapproving. "I'm paid to be," I answered, though not by the hour. This time, I didn't ask questions. I waited. Sometimes the silence makes a better opening than any inquiry. "I was going to leave him," she said finally, staring at a framed photograph of a younger Alaric Hutchins in full vestments. "He suspected, but he never accused me, not directly." "Was it someone else?" She hesitated. "There was affection elsewhere, but nothing grotesque." "Affection doesn't poison sermons," I said. She flinched just slightly. He'd changed, cold, remote. He was ashamed, I think, not of me, but of how he'd come to see the world. That was too honest to be rehearsed and too bitter to be irrelevant. Back at the brownstone, I reported her words. Wolfe leaned back and closed his eyes. "A man needn't raise his voice to be betrayed," he murmured. "Silence will do." It was Clare, in a moment that felt more like confession than collaboration, who offered the sentence Wolfe would later refer to as the fulcrum of meaning. We were reviewing the bishop's scattered notes, sermon drafts, scribbled marginalia. Wolfe had insisted on chronological order, not for ritual but for context. Clare pointed to a page dated 6 days before the bishop's death, where a line was underlined twice. "If I die before I speak, someone else will finish my sermon." "He said that to me too," she murmured. "One evening. I thought he meant Luen, or maybe he was just being melodramatic." Wolfe took the paper from her hands and held it a moment. "It's not melodrama," he said. "It's a contingency, a signal he didn't explain further, which was classic Wolfe. But I saw the shift, not in posture, but in pace. Something had clicked, silently and deeply. I made a note of the line, though I didn't know yet what it meant. Wolfe did, or he would. You could see it forming behind his eyes like weather in a glass. The call came just after dusk while Wolfe and I were debating the merits of a third cup of coffee and the grammatical imprecision of a bishop's sermon clause. The voice on the other end was Clare's, tight, frayed. "It's Paul," she said. "He's dead." It took a second. "Luen?" "Yes, they found him at the cathedral. He fell from the staircase above the crypt. They say it was suicide." Wolfe, hearing only my half of the conversation, reached for his notebook without asking. I hung up, relayed the facts. Wolfe didn't blink. "No note?" he asked. "None found." Witnesses? Only echo and stone. He tapped his finger once. A fall from a stone stairway in a crypt, convenient, symbolic, and silent. You don't think? I think, Wolfe said, that Reverend Luen was the only person besides Clare and the late bishop who understood what the sermon truly implied. And now he is beyond contradiction. We sat for a while in the quiet. Murder can speak in many languages, but now it had chosen the dialect of grief, and Wolfe, whether he liked it or not, had started to listen. Inspector Kramer has many gifts, but reverence for ambiguity isn't among them. When he arrived at the brownstone the morning after Luen's death, he had a folder in one hand and steam rising from his collar. Fell from the crypt stairs, he said. Dead when they found him. No witnesses, no sign of struggle, no note. Suicide. Wolfe didn't look up from his eggs. Nonsense. Kramer barked something that might have been a word. Wolfe continued. He was the bishop's protégé, privy to sensitive matters and fully aware of the sermon's implications. If he intended self-erasure, he'd have chosen a more private method. There were bruises, I added. Upper arms, consistent with being gripped. Kramer scowled. The coroner called them post-mortem artifacts. Wolfe allowed himself a slight grunt. A convenient euphemism for inadequate curiosity. Kramer tossed the folder onto the desk. You're building castles in incense. I want facts, not liturgical conjecture. You'll have them, Wolfe said calmly, once I've exhumed the living. And with that, the bishop's death had its first confirmed companion. Wolfe had me spread the torn sermon draft across his desk, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and for a man who had once compared religious writing to linguistic embroidery on an invisible garment, he handled it with uncommon focus. The sheet bore 4 initials, all underlined in blue pencil. One matched Harlan Coyle. Another resembled the bishop's secretary's name, although Clare denied knowledge of it. The third belonged to a donor who'd recently revised their giving downward, and the fourth was illegible, the corner stained and frayed. But it was the phrase halfway down the page that froze Wolfe's gaze. The treasurer counts more than coin. He tapped it once. An accusation, Mr. Goodwin, dressed in poetic fig leaves, but unmistakably anatomical. You think Coyle's been cooking more than books? I think, Wolfe said, that the bishop had taken the unusual step of translating private knowledge into public risk. A sermon, by nature, is a declaration. This one reads like a masked indictment. I folded the page and placed it back in the file. Then I'd say it's time we met the accountant who inspired such scripture. Wolfe didn't reply, but his silence was not absence. It was arrangement. If you ever want to test a man's innocence, show up unannounced after hours and see what he's shredding. I waited until 9:30, slipped into the side entrance of the diocesan office with a key Clare loaned me under the heading of grave concern, and found Harlan Coyle alone in his office, his sleeves rolled, and his expression caught halfway between guilt and indigestion. The whir of the shredder was unmistakable. "Oh," he said as I entered. Didn't expect anyone," I finished for him. He gestured vaguely. "Just clearing out outdated files." "Of course. What's the best year to discard diocesan financial ledgers? I always forget." He flushed and made a half-hearted attempt to pull the bin. I leaned against the door frame. "Tell me, Mr. Coyle, were you aware the bishop commissioned an audit?" His eyes flicked sideways. No, he never mentioned it. A poor lie, shallow and unpolished. "Funny," I said, "because someone else mentioned your name in a sermon, and it wasn't to thank you for stewardship." He didn't reply, but the shredder did, grinding away what sounded suspiciously like the last breath of plausible deniability. When Wolfe summoned Vera Hutchkins, he didn't so much interrogate her as let her walk slowly toward the edge of her own stage. She arrived veiled and unsmiling, and within 15 minutes had begun to unwrap more than fabric. "I found the will," she said, voice even. "It was in his desk, not hidden, but not obvious either." And you destroyed it, Wolfe stated. She hesitated. I did. Why? To protect myself. I thought it would be scandalous, that he meant to embarrass me. Not disinherit? No. Her lips thinned. He was not that cruel. And yet you ensured his final intention would never be known. Her eyes flashed, just briefly. He never told me what was in it. He left me to imagine the worst. Wolfe nodded slowly, as if cataloguing human frailty into familiar folders. Emotion is seldom accurate, he said, but it leaves fingerprints. When she left, she said nothing else. Wolfe, of course, had noted every gesture. Half a confession, he said afterward, which is to say, half a lie. The next morning, Wolfe dispatched me to the St. Agnes Retreat Centre in Riverdale, an ivy-draped sanctuary for clergy who preferred their silence monastic and their truths selective. I found Father Anton Marchand in a small study panelled with wood older than sin. He was brittle in posture but alert in gaze, the sort of priest who looked like he'd heard every confession and still waited for one that surprised him. I knew Bishop Hutchins well, he said. He came here often, spoke of a burden. What kind? The kind that presses on a man who believes righteousness is incompatible with the institution he serves. He motioned to a leather-bound ledger. He left me notes, not of crimes, of concerns. He believed the Restoration Fund was being exploited. By whom? Father Anton's eyes narrowed. He never named names, but he planned to speak. He said, "If I die, the sermon will be louder." I copied a few of the phrases, thanked the priest, and left. Back at the brownstone, I placed the quotes in front of Wolfe. Interesting, he said. He believed truth outlives the speaker. Or, I added, he hoped it would. Wolfe said nothing, but hope, in his lexicon, ranked below motive. Digging into diocesan finances without a collar or a rosary is like asking for the wine list in a confessional. Frowned upon, but revealing. Between Clare's quiet guidance and a reluctant tip from a clerk with enough scruples to frown, I found the bishop had zeroed in on the Restoration Fund, specifically a series of payouts labelled structural reserves and historical preservation, all oddly frequent and never followed by receipts. When I reported this to Wolfe, he skimmed my notes, then leaned back and closed his eyes. The bishop knew, he said, but he waited. For what? I asked. A moment, Wolfe replied. A pulpit. A silence that would make his words ring. He opened his eyes and tapped the notes. That moment came Sunday. He didn't name the guilty, but he built a scaffold, and someone cut the rope before he could hang the flags. It wasn't poetic. But then Wolfe rarely was, at least not on purpose. That evening, Saul Panzer entered the office with the unceremonious efficiency of a man who has already solved half the puzzle and is waiting for the rest of us to catch up. He placed a slim folder on Wolfe's desk. 2 large withdrawals, he said. 4 days before the bishop's death. One for $18,000, one for $27,500. Both routed through a holding account tied to the cathedral. Purpose? Wolfe asked. None listed, and the signatures don't match the regular signatories. Wolfe raised a brow. Forgery? Number authorization by proxy. Which proxy? Coyle, Saul said. Under direction. I couldn't confirm whose. He added a second sheet. Luen accessed those files 3 days ago. Marked them. Highlighted irregularities. Did he speak to anyone? Not officially, but he pulled the records. That much is certain. Wolfe picked up the folder and studied the columns. Then, he said quietly, he died for the bishop's sermon, even if he never stepped to the pulpit. There was no argument from Saul, and I didn't offer one. Because in Wolfe's world, data and death speak the same language, and both had just named their next question. Wolfe, in one of his better moods, was seated with his fingertips resting against each other like diplomats in conference. The news of Luen's death had settled over the brownstone like incense, sweet on the surface, choking beneath. He was murdered, Wolfe said flatly, not because he was faithful, but because he was informed. I looked up from my notes. He wasn't a threat, not publicly. No, Wolfe replied, but he had access. To the bishop's revisions, to the financial audit, to the identities of those most imperiled by the truth. What he lacked in power, he compensated for in proximity. I leaned back. So the killer panicked. Not panicked, calculated. Eliminating Luen removed both a conscience and a conduit. He would not have delivered the sermon, but he might have confirmed it. Wolfe stood, or nearly, and crossed to the bookshelf, which was always more gesture than necessity. This is no longer about supposition, he said. It is about removal. And the way he said removal left no doubt he meant something bloodless and entirely final. It was Wolfe's idea to enlist Vivian's Salma, which surprised me. He normally considered gossip columns a frivolous corruption of ink, though I've always maintained they serve a strategic purpose when wielded with discretion and a loaded quote. "Call her," Wolfe said. "You will imply carefully that I have reason to suspect a person of clerical authority in the death of Bishop Hutchins and the subsequent demise of Reverend Luen. Nothing libelous, just oxygen for the flame." Am I naming names? Certainly not. You're inviting curiosity, the kind that stirs public scrutiny before the subject has time to pray for invisibility. So I called Vivian. She answered on the third ring with a voice like champagne poured through linen. I fed her the bait. Wolfe's grave suspicions and concerning coincidences. I let her supply the adjectives. She had a drawer full. By the next morning, her column in the Manhattan Courier featured this gem. A certain portly genius of West 35th Street is said to be sniffing around the bishop's beer, suspecting more than sanctity beneath the cassock. No names, of course. Yet. Wolfe read it, folded the paper, and muttered, "Now let us see who bolts first." Dean Malcolm Reeves arrived at the brownstone 2 hours after the paper hit the stands, his collar slightly askew, and his composure in tatters. I showed him into the office, where Wolfe remained seated, serene and immovable. "This is slander," Reeves snapped before I'd even shut the door. "You're inciting public speculation with no evidence." Wolfe regarded him as one might an irate parishioner disrupting a liturgy. "You refer, I assume, to Miss Salma's column? I had no part in its authorship." "But you gave her a statement." Wolfe's lips curled faintly. "Mr. Goodwin speaks freely. I do not constrain him unless the subject is cookery." Reeves flushed. "You're harming the church." Wolfe's gaze sharpened. "No, sir. I am investigating the deaths of 2 men, one righteous, one innocent. The church need not suffer, unless its members compel it." Reeves turned to me. "And Clare Talbot? I suppose she's feeding you ghost stories now?" I smiled. "She feeds us less than you'd imagine, and more than you'd prefer." He left without shaking hands, muttering something unliturgical under his breath. Wolfe watched him go, then murmured, "If guilt were a vestment, he'd be draped in brocade." Clare returned that evening with a scrap of paper folded into a small envelope, as if it were either precious or radioactive. I opened it under Wolfe's eye and saw at once what she meant. A torn corner of the bishop's sermon. Not the same draft we'd reviewed, but another. The ink was faded, but legible. And even the CO dash has counted his coin too often. CO dash, Wolfe read aloud. "That's not theology, it's nomenclature." "Coil?" I offered. "Unlikely to be anyone else," Wolfe replied. "The bishop, it seems, left breadcrumbs, but someone else brought birds." Clare looked uncertain. "It was in a wastebasket, half-burned. I don't know how it survived." Wolfe gave a small nod. But it did. He rose, uncharacteristically, and crossed to the globe. A sure sign the air had thickened. "This," he said, tapping the fragment, "is not evidence. It is motive, unpolished and unfinished, which is why someone tried to erase it." "And failed," I said. "For now," Wolfe murmured. "But failure in this matter will not be allowed to become habit." And just like that, the bishop's voice, half erased, had returned to whisper its unfinished sentence. If Harlan Coyle had a weakness beyond creative bookkeeping, it was an unfortunate trust in solitude, the kind that makes men think they're invisible once the vesper bells stop ringing. He left the cathedral office around 6, no tie, no briefcase, and walked like a man headed toward anonymity. I let him get half a block ahead before I shadowed him south through the avenues, past vendors closing carts and dogs pulling leashes. His pace picked up in Hell's Kitchen, which was either a sign of fear or familiarity. He turned onto a narrow side street just west of 10th, then slipped into a low-lit bar marked only by a faded neon glass. I waited 3 minutes before easing up to the window. Inside, he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a man with shoulders like a butcher's block and a pair of hands that looked like they'd negotiated contracts on concrete. Money changed hands. The other man lit a cigarette, and Coyle nodded too fast, like a pupil who'd promised not to ask questions. I watched 10 minutes, then moved on. Whatever he was laundering, it wasn't linen. I caught him outside a municipal garage on 47th, heading for his car with the subtle grace of a man hoping not to be remembered. I let him fumble with his keys before stepping into view. He jumped, not much, but enough. "Mr. Coyle," I said, "forgive the ambiance, but I find confessions taste best with exhaust fumes." He opened his mouth, closed it again, and leaned against the fender like it might pray for him. "I didn't kill anyone," he said finally, "if that's what you're after." "Not yet, but let's talk about the restoration fund." He winced. "It was discretionary, off books. I moved it to keep it clean." "By handing it to a man with 3 aliases and a sealed indictment in Queens?" Coyle sighed. "It was never for me. I was instructed." "By whom?" He hesitated. "Let's say the bishop knew and told me to stop, quietly. No police, no scandal." "And Reverend Luen?" "He found the file," Coyle whispered. "I begged him to let it go. Wolfe, when I relayed the exchange, said only, 'He confesses to the fire,' but not the flame. And that, in his vocabulary, meant we were near the edge of revelation." Wolfe called the conclave for the following afternoon. The invitations were phrased as requests, but no one with guilt, actual or imagined, declines a summons from Nero Wolfe, especially when the summons implies finality. Clare arrived first, composed but tight-lipped. Reeves followed, collar pressed and voice dry. Vera swept in last in a coat too elegant for daylight and an expression too neutral for innocence. Coyle, already seated, had the colour of unvarnished chalk. Fritz served nothing. Wolfe didn't rise. He spoke slowly, more judge than host. "You are here," he said, "not because I possess proof, but because I have accumulated meaning." That quieted even Reeves. "The bishop died before he could speak," Wolfe continued, "but his sermon, though torn, survives in pieces, scattered across your recollections and your omissions. I propose, therefore, to reconstruct it." The air shifted. I noted fingers tightening around chair arms, eyes flicking, too quickly, from one face to another. Wolfe reached for a single page, Clare's torn fragment. "Shall we begin?" he said, with the name that was almost erased. And in the pause that followed, the air itself began to suspect someone. He hadn't spoken 3 sentences when it happened. Wolfe had just read aloud the bishop's line, "Even the CO has counted his coin too often," when Vera Hutchins rose. Not abruptly, but with that unnatural grace that screams controlled panic to anyone who's watched a woman flee a ballroom or a courtroom. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I don't feel—" "Sit down," Wolfe said, not loudly, but with such finality that even the orchids upstairs must have flinched. She didn't. She turned toward the door, one step, then another. I stood. She stopped. Reeves made a motion to help, or to intercept. It was impossible to tell. Wolfe leaned forward, eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Hutchins, if you leave now, you declare yourself. Not to me, but to the others, including the man who helped you." She froze, 1 foot forward, 1 foot behind, suspended in decision. Then slowly, she turned back and sat. No one spoke for a full minute. When Wolfe resumed, his voice was softer, not out of mercy, but precision. Because now, with one attempt to escape, the confession had already begun. Wolfe began, not with thunder, but with parchment. He leaned back in the oversized throne he called a chair and unfolded a tattered sermon draft with the precision of a man about to recite scripture, though the look in his eyes was anything but reverent. His voice, when it came, was soft and civil. "God is not mocked," he read. "Even the cloth can cloak a dagger." The words had weight, not for their theology, which Wolfe routinely dismissed as the most ornate superstition ever institutionalized, but for what they implied. Across the room, Vera Hutchins froze, a fraction of breath, then another, and then her composure splintered. She stood too quickly, too gracefully, and too late to look unbothered. I should go," she murmured, but her heel caught the corner of the rug and betrayed her. It wasn't a stumble, just enough of a falter to mark the guilt in her limbs. Wolfe didn't lift a finger. "No, madam, you may not." She reached the door before I did, but not before Wolfe's words had left their mark. I was already in motion as she twisted the knob. If there's a rule in the brownstone older than Wolfe's resistance to stairs, it's this. Fritz Brenner does not chase, not women, not thieves, not meatloaf recipes stolen by rivals, which meant that Vera Hutchins, moving like a storm in heels, was mine to intercept. I caught her by the side entrance, just past the stoop, where the shadows wrapped tighter than her tailored coat. She wasn't crying, not the kind of woman who stains her own collar, but her face had gone from alabaster to ash in under 10 seconds. "Don't," I said, simply holding out an arm. "You make it past me and I yell, Fritz won't chase, but he might tackle. We'd both regret it." She hesitated, then something inside her folded, not snapped, just sagged like old linen. She stepped back, chin up, lips pressed shut. I didn't touch her, just escorted her in with silence and distance. By the time we returned to the office, she looked like marble again, but the tremor in her glove as she removed it was the sound of glass under velvet. Wolfe didn't move. "Shall we proceed?" It didn't take the rack or even brandy, just Wolfe's gaze, steady, dispassionate, and mercilessly still, like a mirror that showed nothing but the truth. Vera sat, but she didn't settle. "I wasn't going to tell you," she said, voice flat. "Not because I'm ashamed, though perhaps I should be, but because I doubted it mattered anymore." Wolfe raised a brow, but said nothing. The vacuum invited honesty. "I loved Malcolm Reeves," she said. "I was with him. For over a year I didn't blink." Wolfe didn't flinch, but I noted that she hadn't used the word affair, which meant she was still clinging to some moral vocabulary. "The bishop found out," she continued. "I don't know how. He never confronted me directly, but he changed. He became remote, cold. There were glances, and then the will." Wolfe spoke softly. "He did not denounce you?" "No." She looked at Wolfe now, not as a man, but as a judge. That was the worst part. He simply stopped looking at me like a person. There was a stillness that filled the room like incense. "And Reeves?" Wolfe asked. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Wolfe never liked dragging truth into the open unless it served a structural purpose. He wasn't interested in catharsis. He wanted the blueprint, the flaw, and the fulcrum. "Let us review," he said. "The bishop, having uncovered your liaison, rewrites his will. Not out of spite, that would have been human, but in the hopes of accountability." Vera said nothing. Wolfe pressed on. "You discover this. Perhaps you read it. Perhaps not. You didn't need to. You only needed to fear it." She lowered her gaze. I was terrified of scandal, of disgrace. Wolfe's voice remained clinical. "So you substituted it?" She nodded. "I placed the old one back," He never checked. And then, Wolfe added, he died. I thought it would end quietly, she whispered. He would pass, the old will would stand, and no one would know. But the sermon, Wolfe said, was already written. She shivered, not theatrically, but like someone standing too close to her own shadow. It wasn't justice Wolfe had summoned, not yet, but precision. And Vera, at last, was stepping into its light. There's a sound a lie makes when it dies. Not dramatic, not loud, but quiet, like a breath drawn and never returned. Vera Hutchins gave that sound just after Wolfe asked, "Did you pour the bishop's brandy yourself?" She nodded once, without fanfare. "Yes." "And the digitalis?" Her voice dropped a degree. "In the decanter, just a touch, less than a teaspoon." Wolfe's eyelids lowered, which in his dialect was a thunderclap. "A fatal dose, Mrs. Hutchins. I didn't think—" She stopped herself. "I thought he would sleep. I thought his heart would give out. Quietly. At home." I jotted the phrase because Wolfe wouldn't need it, but the district attorney would. She folded her hands in her lap again, as if arranging guilt into symmetry. "He always drank brandy before bed," she continued, "always from the crystal decanter. I knew the dosage from my sister's prescriptions. She had rheumatic palpitations. I just adjusted." "For what?" Wolfe murmured. "Efficiency? Dignity? For mercy," she said. "It wasn't supposed to be a spectacle." "It wasn't," Wolfe replied. "It was a sermon." The silence that followed was colder than accusation. Vera looked up, and I saw that she was no longer hoping to be believed, only remembered. There's a hierarchy to guilt. Vera wore hers like a cloak, tailored and deliberate. But Wolfe wasn't done layering it. "And Reverend Luen?" he asked mildly. She looked up, startled. "I had nothing to do with that. God help me, I swear it." Wolfe's eyes narrowed just slightly. "I will permit the invocation given the context, but mind the tone." She straightened. "I didn't kill Paul. I didn't even see him again. That was Reeves." Wolfe gave a slight tilt of the head. "Ah." "He panicked," she said, after Clare brought him the sermon fragment. "He thought Paul might talk, or had already." Wolfe said nothing. "He told me that Paul had fallen." But I knew his voice. He was unraveling. Wolfe studied her face with the cool scrutiny of a surgeon preparing to cut. "You did not stop him." "I didn't know until it was too late." "You knew enough," Wolfe said. She didn't cry, but she no longer sat tall. I could see the verdict behind Wolfe's gaze, but he wasn't ready to voice it. Not until he had all the sins aligned like chess pieces on the board. Wolfe rarely shifted his weight in the chair, unless tectonic justice was about to erupt. He shifted now. "You," he said to Vera, "killed deliberately." His voice was not loud. It never needed to be. "You prepared the means, ensured the moment, and selected the silence." She didn't flinch. "You," he turned to Reeves, "killed by necessity." "But necessity in your case was cowardice." Reeves opened his mouth. Wolfe silenced it with a glance. "I am no court," he continued, "nor priest. I cannot pardon. I do not seek to condemn, but I will name what is true." The room was heavy with a kind of airless calm, as if all respiration had agreed to pause. "You are murderers," Wolfe said, "and your motives were not spiritual, they were human, which is why absolution does not belong in this room." There was no protest, only the faintest sound of Clare's breath catching in the corner. I looked to Wolfe. He was still, composed, and utterly unwilling to grant them a shred of mercy they hadn't earned. We waited. Because the truth wasn't done speaking. Clare Hutchins didn't speak often, but when she did, it rang with clarity, like stained glass catching sun. She turned her gaze to Wolfe, not with challenge, but with something heavier. If he knew about the affair, why didn't he leave her? Wolfe didn't answer immediately. He tilted his head back, fingers steepled. When he did speak, it was not in thunder but dusk. Because he believed in forgiveness, Wolfe said. More than justice. Clare's lips parted, but no words came. He was a man of faith, Wolfe continued, which is not the same as being a fool, though the line is often narrow. He believed that moral failure was not final, that a heart, even a divided one, could return. Was he wrong? Clare asked, voice almost a whisper. Wolfe closed his eyes. Wrong? Number, but he forgot one thing. What? Wolfe opened his eyes. That forgiveness to be worthy must be chosen, not presumed, not manipulated. He offered it as a gift. They used it as cover. Silence returned. I didn't speak. Neither did Clare. And Wolfe, having delivered the last sermon the bishop never could, reached for his beer, drank, in silence, for the dead. Inspector Kramer arrived like a man forced to attend Mass after reading Voltaire. His scowl was the same one he wore during rainstorms, budget hearings, and any occasion requiring deference to Nero Wolfe. He entered without waiting for a welcome. Fritz had learned long ago that offering coffee only made things worse and planted himself just shy of Wolfe's desk like a man approaching a reluctant confessor. You sent for me, he growled. I did, Wolfe said, folding his hands as if presiding. 2 individuals await your escort, Miss Vera Hutchkins and Dean Malcolm Reeves. Kramer's eyes darted to me. I shrugged. We're merely the ushers. He looked back to Wolfe. You're saying it's both of them? I rarely speak in metaphor, Inspector, but yes, the woman mixed the chalice and the man rang the bell. Kramer's lips twitched. Is that your official version or just something for the papers? Wolfe's gaze didn't shift. It is the truth. That should suffice. Kramer didn't thank him. He turned on his heel to claim his suspects, but not before I saw it. That flicker in his eyes. Wolfe had turned the altar into a courtroom, and Kramer, like the rest of us, had come to witness. Wolfe had postponed satisfaction long enough. With the players removed and the air finally still, he began the recital, not with relish, but precision. It was, I admit, something to watch. The instrument, he said, was digitalis, introduced not in haste, but calculation. Miss Hutchins knew the bishop's habits, brandy before bed, decanted to avoid the appearance of indulgence. She applied a dose just sufficient to quiet the heart overnight. A gentle exit, but it did not cooperate. I nodded. His heart lasted long enough to rewrite the will. Indeed, Wolfe's tone was dry. He changed his testament not to punish, but to preserve. Unfortunately, the new document did not survive him. Miss Hutchins ensured that he paused to sip beer, a ceremonial act, then continued. But sermons, he said, are less easily destroyed. The bishop's draft, torn and discarded, contained a clue, a fragment suggesting his final moral reckoning. That fragment reached Paul Luen. And Paul, I offered, was a better man than he was brave. Reeves, Wolfe concluded, saw to that. There was no dramatic flourish, no gavel strike, just logic, layered and exacting, laid out like a chalice on the altar of evidence. The death, Wolfe said, his voice steady, was Vera Hutchins's. He meant it in the grammatical sense. It belonged to her. Not emotionally. Wolfe had no interest in sentiment, but factually. She'd laced the glass. She'd measured the moment. She had, in his calculus, taken the life. But, he added with the air of a man drawing a second blade from his cloak, the silence was Malcolm Reeves's. He leaned forward, slightly, which for Wolfe was the equivalent of shouting from a rooftop. Luen, he said, was not silenced by the divine. He was eliminated by a man afraid of truth, afraid of exposure, afraid of shame, not for the affair, but for the ambition behind it. I could almost hear Reeves's voice again from earlier, oily and trembling, justifying compromise in the name of peace. Together, Wolfe concluded, they made the sacrament whole, one in act, the other in erasure. If that sounds poetic, blame Wolfe. He had a way of turning facts into liturgy. But make no mistake, the elegance was his scalpel, and by the time he finished, both parties had been cleanly, surgically laid bare. Harlan Coyle never stood trial in the brownstone. He didn't need to. His guilt wasn't dramatic, no poison, no panic, just accounting ledgers cooked to a fine spiritual glaze. And, unlike the others, he hadn't killed. He'd only stolen faith in the decimal system. Wolfe, ever the pragmatist, offered Kramer a morsel. "You will find, Inspector, that exposing Mr. Coyle's offences would cost the church more in dignity than in restitution." Kramer's jaw clenched. "You're asking me to bury a theft?" "I'm suggesting," Wolfe said smoothly, "that you let the church bury its own dead." Kramer grunted. "I'm keeping the ledger." Wolfe inclined his head. "That will suffice." And so the treasurer, that harmless-seeming vessel of petty greed, walked out not in handcuffs but with his collar unrumpled, his punishment delegated to silence, whispers, and the slow exile that institutions reserve for those they cannot publicly scold. There are men Wolfe despises, but few he curses. Reeves earned that rare category. "You," Wolfe said quietly, "have made a sanctuary of cowardice." Reeves blinked. "I don't understand." "No, you don't." Wolfe's voice darkened. "You speak of mercy, but wield it as camouflage. You claim dignity, but use it as alibi." Reeves flushed, the colour crawling up his neck like a confession finally reaching the pulpit. "I acted in fear," he murmured. "I was desperate." "Desperation," Wolfe snapped, "does not justify murder. It only explains it." I'd heard Wolfe scold, chide, and intellectually dismantle many a soul, but this was different. He wasn't proving a point. He was cleansing the room of something oily and false. "You took the bishop's silence," Wolfe said, "as consent." "But he stayed because he believed people could be redeemed. You proved him wrong." Reeves sat very still. His hands twitched once, and Wolfe, with a final glance of contempt, added, "The church may absolve you, but I will not." It was not theology, it was judgment, delivered from a detective's desk instead of a stained-glass altar. Clare's thank you came late, and not to Wolfe, exactly. More through him. "I don't know what he would have said," she murmured, standing with folded hands. "But I think he'd be grateful." Wolfe offered no reply, not even a nod. His silence wasn't dismissal. It was agreement cloaked in restraint. "You gave him a voice," she added, "when others wanted only the echo." I glanced at Wolfe. He was watching her with something just short of emotion, the look he reserved for fine orchids blooming out of season. Clare didn't cry, she didn't linger, she just left, with her dignity and the last word both intact. And Wolfe, who could savage a liar in 2 syllables, said nothing. Sometimes gratitude is best received by remaining immobile. He did that part to perfection. Later, after the chairs were empty, after Fritz had restored the dignity of the rug, I asked the question I'd been holding like an unpaid bill. "So why this one?" Wolfe didn't look up from his beer. "You object to ecclesiastical inquiries?" "No, but you're not usually moved by poisoned bishops or choir scandals." He exhaled, not quite a sigh. I was intrigued. "That's not an answer." Wolfe's gaze lifted. "Because, Archie, murder behind stained glass is still murder, and I will not be outwitted by hymns." He said it with the finality of a man who had endured too many metaphors disguised as morality. He took a sip, leaned back, and shut his eyes. I didn't push further. Some things, even from Wolfe, come once and vanish like incense. I sat in the chair across from him and said nothing. There was no absolution that night, only truth. And Wolfe, at peace, or at least unbothered, by the sound of his own mind, finally at rest. The orchid room hadn't changed, but Wolfe had become more devout about it, if such a thing were possible. That Thursday morning, weeks after the last gavel had fallen in the sanctuary of justice, I found him there, tending to his botanical clergy with a solemnity even the bishop might have admired. He didn't hum. Wolfe never hums. But his hands moved with something near reverence. The rest of the world had moved on, predictably and without style. Vera Hutchins's photo had made page 3 of the Ledger, just below an advertisement for cologne and well above an article on municipal bond rates. Dean Reeves had vanished into the administrative ether, where those with stained reputations are promoted sideways. Harlan Coyle was probably laundering indulgences somewhere in Queens. And Wolfe? He snipped a mericillium with surgical care, murmured something Latin under his breath, and didn't mention murder once. The silence wasn't awkward, it was curated. I let it breathe until the sound of the mail slot punctuated it like a cough in a cathedral. The envelope was pale blue, with handwriting that belonged to someone who had once written hymns and now only addressed things that couldn't be sung. "Clare," I said aloud. Wolfe gave no indication that the name altered his respiration. I opened it. The letter was short, not abrupt, just measured. She had left the church. Not with fire or fury, but something closer to resignation seasoned by release. "I'm not angry," she wrote, "only done. Faith that required silence is no faith I can carry anymore." She didn't apologize and she didn't ask for blessings. She mentioned a teaching position in a girls' school in Vermont and an apartment with tall windows. "I wanted you to know," the letter ended, "that I remember everything, especially what you didn't say." I folded it slowly. Wolfe looked up, not because he cared about postage, but because he knew the stillness in my pause meant more than ink and paper. "Shall I file it?" I asked. "No." He returned his attention to the orchids. So I left the letter on the windowsill where the light caught it but didn't burn it, which, as metaphors go, wasn't half bad. Fritz had gone Lenten on us. The meal was modest to the point of ecclesiastical. 3 slices of rye, a bowl of celery soup, and something involving lentils that had the colour of remorse and the consistency of guilt. Wolfe poked at it with the caution of a man inspecting evidence. "What is this?" "Seasonal," Fritz offered. "March repentance." Wolfe grimaced. "I'm not repentant. I'm hungry." "You solved a murder in a cathedral," I said. "Maybe this is penance." He gave me a look. One of those slow, deliberate pivots that suggests I'd just spoken blasphemy in the sanctuary. "For whom?" he asked. "Yourself, maybe. Or the bishop. Or Fritz, for serving this." Wolfe snorted. "Penance presumes sin. I committed no sin." "But you did trespass on holy ground." "I trespassed," he said, "only on stupidity. We ate. Or rather, Fritz and I did." Wolfe managed to swallow enough to avoid issuing a formal complaint. It wasn't the food that had soured him, it was the lingering aftertaste of ecclesiastical hypocrisy, something no amount of lemon zest could cut through. The copy arrived via a quarterly journal so obscure it made Modern Theology Digest look like Time magazine. Wolfe didn't subscribe, naturally, but Lon Cohen had tipped me off, and I had it delivered under plain brown wrapper, which amused me more than it did him. The article had no byline, but the title told me everything I needed: A Kingdom Without Shadows. It was a careful reconstruction, not a forgery. The voice was the bishop's, tender but precise, stern without cruelty. Clare had kept her promise. She hadn't rewritten him, only reassembled him from the scraps others had tried to bury. She quoted the passage we'd seen only in torn corners and hesitant glances. "Justice," it read, "is only justice if it survives the darkness it fears." Wolfe read it in full, twice. He didn't comment, didn't annotate, but when he finished, he placed the journal beside his chair instead of in the wastebasket, which for Wolfe was the equivalent of genuflecting. I didn't say a word. Sometimes sermons don't need pulpits, and sometimes Nero Wolfe lets truth sit on his table untouched because it has already done what it came to do. Wolfe's disdain for the pulpit was no secret. He respected form, not faith, facts, not fervour. The only miracles he acknowledged wore chlorophyll and bloomed on schedule. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had settled in him. Not guilt, of course, but perhaps the faint pressure of a thought left unresolved. "You think sermons are useless?" I said, not expecting an answer. Wolfe, eyes closed, hands resting on the armrest like Roman pillars, responded without opening them. "I think sentiment is the enemy of inquiry." "Sure," I said, "but sometimes people aren't puzzles." "People," he replied, "are always puzzles. Only the dishonest ones pretend not to be." I leaned back. There wasn't much left to argue. Wolfe had cracked the case using evidence, motive, and deduction. But the thing that had lingered, the bishop's truth, Clare's letter, even that modest soup Fritz had the nerve to call lunch, hadn't come from forensics. They came from something messier. I didn't call it faith. Wolfe would have objected to the term, but it was something. And not all silences, I was starting to believe, meant ignorance. The case had ended officially. The reports were filed, the files stored, and Kramer had left with his usual blend of scorn and satisfaction. But something remained. The bishop's words, what Clare had stitched together from memory and scrap, lived on. Too late for the man who wrote them, maybe, but not too late for her. Or us. Wolfe, naturally, found no poetry in it. "It is irony," he said. I let that hang in the air like the last breath of an organ note. "Is that all?" He considered. "Irony is sufficient. It contains both justice and its absence." It was one of those moments when I couldn't tell if he was showing off or quietly grieving. Probably both. Wolfe had a way of placing philosophy like stones, heavy, unmoved, and deliberate. The thing was, I didn't disagree. Sometimes justice doesn't show up on time. Sometimes it arrives in disguise, as a sermon in a fringe journal or a resignation letter in a woman's careful hand. But when it comes, even late, you feel it. And Wolfe, for all his protestations, felt it too. It was dusk on West 35th, the kind that turns windows into mirrors and makes the city look older than it is. I was seated in my usual spot, legs stretched, tie loosened, with just enough air in the room to let the day go without complaint. Wolfe was reading a monograph on South American hybrids. He hadn't spoken in 20 minutes, which meant he was either absorbing or ignoring. With Wolfe, the distinction was academic. So I asked, "If a man speaks the truth and dies for it, is he a martyr, or just another fool with bad timing?" He didn't answer. Not because he didn't hear me, and not because he didn't have an answer, but because the question didn't want one. It was the kind of inquiry that made Wolfe retreat into silence, not out of impotence, but reverence for puzzles unsolved and motives unmeasured. I didn't push it. Outside, the city stirred, as indifferent as ever. Inside, Wolfe turned a page, and I let the question remain. Not unanswered, just unclaimed, like so many truths that arrive too late. In the end, justice did not wear robes nor offer absolution. It arrived, as it often does, in silence, carried not by thunder, but by reason, persistence, and the refusal to let a dead man's voice vanish beneath ceremony. The bishop's truth surfaced too late to save him, but just in time to matter. And for some, perhaps that's enough. For others, perhaps not. Do you believe forgiveness can ever excuse silence in the face of evil? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes